PTSD is not just for veterans. Rebecca here, and today on ALifeLearned, I'm going to talk to you about things not commonly known about post-traumatic stress disorder.
Ideas are bulletproof.
To many, PTSD is actually most commonly known as shell shock because a lot of people tend to associate it with military people and the trauma that they tend to experience on the field. But as many of us know, you don't just have to be in the military in order to experience trauma in your life. Using myself as an example, I've never been involved with the military beyond a little bit of Sea Cadets, and I actually have post-traumatic stress disorder, to which I'm receiving counseling for right now. 1 in 2 people will actually experience a traumatic event in their life, but most people tend to actually work through the grieving process and not have it stay with them in a detrimental fashion. The memory will fade, though it will still be painful, but not destructive. But with post-traumatic stress disorder, people can't quite heal, they can't fully move through the grieving process, and the pain of what's happened stays with them, and in staying with them, it tends to create long-term traumatic effects on the brain. In all cases where post-traumatic stress disorder does develop, it is always from a traumatic event that was either severe or prolonged and had a very drastic effect on the person. And one thing to note is that, as I said, not everyone does get this condition. It is genetically based as well as environmentally based. But in the end, the key is that they were in some kind of life-threatening situation which caused their brain to be traumatized. And something not commonly known about PTSD is that childhood neglect is one of the environmental factors that sets people up to be vulnerable to it. It's actually one of the most common ways that anybody can be vulnerable to developing PTSD, because as a child, we are dependent on our parents to provide for us. General comfort, nourishment, shelter, and care are things that children should be able to take for granted. Their ability to take these things for granted is what allows them to develop properly. But when it comes to childhood neglect, children experience situations where they're not sure where their next meal is coming from. They're not sure if they're safe every day. They don't know if they're loved or cared for, depending on the situation. And this can lead to the brain developing insecurities and developing certain structures that make them more susceptible to developing post-traumatic stress disorder if they experience a traumatic event later on in life. This overall lack of attention and feeling of insecurity that neglected children have tends to lead to them having difficulty moving through the grieving process and thus leaving their brains more traumatized than most people after traumatic life-threatening events. Unfortunately, child neglect is rather rampant in the US and Canada these days. It's even more common than sexual abuse or physical abuse because it's just so much easier for people to neglect rather than actively abuse. But in the same sense, neglect is a form of abuse, and taken further, neglect tends to typically coincide with physical or emotional abuse, and so a lot of children who are neglected do actually end up developing childhood PTSD. And this is one of the most uncommon things known about post-traumatic stress disorder, is that it's not veterans who develop it most, but rather neglected children and people who are left in traumatic situations and can't finish through the grieving process. So the big thing to note here is that child care is a big part of preventing this type of mental illness. If children are properly cared for and nourished when they're young and developing, their brains will be a lot less susceptible to developing this kind of mental disorder. But with this, I do want to explain a big misconception that I feel a lot of people have, and that is that people like to think of illness and disorder as different things, and they aren't. Depending on the literature, they might use the term illness or disease or disorder, but in general, they're all talking about the same thing, particularly with post-traumatic stress disorder and mental health issues. All of these things are basically definite pathological processes that are characterized by symptoms in particular, and some are healable, some aren't. But distinguishing that illnesses are healable and diseases aren't, or diseases are healable and illnesses aren't, is really unhealthy in trying to work through mental health disorders. A lot of people are afraid to be classified with a mental health disorder or disease because they think that that means they're permanently ill, they're permanently sick, and there's no getting better. But this leads me into another subject a lot of people don't know about, and that is neuroplasticity. This is incredibly relevant to post-traumatic stress disorder because this is how you heal from it. Neuroplasticity, or brain plasticity, is basically the idea that the brain is moldable or changeable. The pathways in the brain, or the synapses within the brain, can be changed over time with help of medication, as well as changes in the environment. It can also result from bodily injuries or changes in emotion or the way you think. And so this concept basically explains how our brains can constantly change throughout life. We aren't just growing during our childhood. Our brains are plastic throughout our entire existence. And so with someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, they tend to have associations or pathways in their brain that create negative responses, traumatic responses that trigger them and make them very upset, reminding them of the trauma they went through in the past. And through neuroplasticity and therapy, they can learn to change these pathways in their brain and basically heal from the disorder. Now, there is no going back to the way they were before they were traumatized, but with neuroplasticity, there is a way to heal the brain so that these pathways that cause trauma are broken down and aren't used anymore, and the brain goes in a healthier direction. And so that's another really big misconception that I want to clear up about PTSD, is that it's not a permanent disorder or illness or disease that you can never get over. It is healable. It's really, really hard, but it is healable. Now, the level of difficulty that one will face in trying to heal from PTSD will really depend on what type of traumatic disorder that they have. There are actually 5 different classifications or types of post-traumatic stress disorder. That is normal stress response, acute stress disorder, uncomplicated PTSD, comorbid PTSD, and complex PTSD. And the main thing that I want to distinguish is that the most difficult one to recover from is complex PTSD, because it tends to result from prolonged trauma that's happened over a long period of time, and often during childhood. Now, this isn't to say that the other 4 aren't difficult to heal from, they just aren't quite as ingrained into the brain, and thus it might take a little bit less therapy and work in order to change those pathways. But regardless of complex being more difficult to heal from, it is still healable. They are all still healable. It just does take work. And with this work, of course, help and assistance. No one can really do this work on their own. It is so incredibly hard. You are literally changing your brain. I've gone through a lot of therapy myself, and I've experienced how difficult it is, and I still have a ways to go. But with that, I want to be a voice of encouragement that you can heal if you have PTSD. It is possible to heal and not have to constantly medicate yourself for the rest of time in order to cope with your condition. It's just about getting the right help and about constantly wanting to get help. It's really hard to stay encouraged considering how discouraging people can be and how much they don't understand. But if you stay with it, it is difficult, but in the end, very, very much worth it. Now, for anyone who's more interested in the biological parts of PTSD and how it affects the brain and what it does to the body, just go to the link that's right here and you'll see Crash Course Psychology. They are an amazing channel, and they will give you all the details you need about how post-traumatic stress disorder actually affects the brain biologically. So in summary, the main things that I feel people really should know about post-traumatic stress disorder is it's not just for veterans. There are many people who experience trauma and who experience post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards, and a lot of people actually have it as a result of childhood neglect and abuse that's associated with it. And with that, better understanding of where PTSD comes from can really help us in dealing with reducing the amount that people suffer from it. And of course, I really would like everyone to remember it is healable. This is not an endless illness that will just plague you for the rest of your life. You can get through it. You just gotta work on it. So I hope you enjoyed my video. For anyone interested in commenting about their experiences with post-traumatic stress disorder or what they might have learned about the mental disorder, please feel free to comment below and join me again next week where I try again to share a little something I've learned in life.